It's February 17, 2025, and you know what that means?
Time for another deep dive.
We've got two stories today that might seem totally different, at first.
Yeah, different worlds.
But stick with us, okay, because they actually connect in a really interesting way when you think about, like, power, influence, who gets heard in today's world, all
Yeah,
that.
for sure. It's all about control, right? Who's controlling what? Who's got the power?
Exactly. So let's jump right in. The first story comes straight from the Videntis.
Oh, this is a big one.
It is. The Trump administration is actually questioning the birthright citizenship of Native Americans.
Wow.
Born in the U.S., crazy, right?
Yeah, I mean, to understand what they're even talking about, we got to look back in time a bit. Before 1924, you had laws like that Civil Rights Act in 1866 and that Supreme Court case, Elk versus Wilkins.
Elk versus Wilkins?
Yeah, in 1884, basically saying Native Americans weren't automatically U.S. citizens because tribes were seen as separate, like their own nation.
So Elk versus Wilkins, just for those who might not know this case, it denied a Native American man the right to vote.
Right.
Saying his allegiance was to his tribe, not the U.S.
That's huge.
A landmark case for sure. But okay, back to today. Could this really happen? Could Native Americans actually lose their citizenship?
I mean, taking it away completely is very unlikely. The Indian Citizenship Act of 1924, that's pretty solid, but there's more to it.
Okay, so what's the bigger problem here?
It's about tribal sovereignty, like can tribes govern themselves and their land?
Right.
These legal challenges, even if they don't win in court, it's like opening a door to more land grabs, to ignoring treaties.
It's giving me like Indian Termination Act of 1953 vibes.
Oh, yeah.
Remember that? That was a total disaster. Tried to force assimilation, ended federal recognition of tribes. So much land was lost, so much cultural identity.
Awful. Thankfully, they reversed it.
They did, but it's a scary reminder of how vulnerable these communities are.
And think about it, this administration, they love those natural resources.
Found on Native American lands?
Exactly, weakening that tribal sovereignty that makes it easier to get at those resources.
So what does this mean right now for Native Americans?
Well, tribal officials are saying carry your ID everywhere, just in case.
Wow.
There's also worry about health care. A lot of that comes through the Indian Health Service.
Right.
Any change in funding eligibility criteria, that could be devastating.
So bottom line, the legal fight over citizenship probably won't go anywhere, but the impact on tribal sovereignty, that's a real threat.
Absolutely. It's a power struggle between the feds and the tribes, and someone might be trying to tip the scales for their own gain.
Now let's switch gears to another power struggle, but this one's in the tech world and media.
Oh, this should be good.
Elon Musk. It involves him and an ad campaign that got rejected by the Washington Post.
Which is owned by
Jeff Bezos.
Aha. So Bezos has history with both Musk and Trump.
Complicated history, right?
Right off the bat, you've got potential conflicts of interest.
So this ad campaign, it was called Fire Musk.
Catchy.
Common Cause and the SPLC Action Fund teamed up. They were ready to spend big $115,000 to run this ad in the Washington Post on Tuesday.
They said no.
They did.
Why?
Well, every outlet has advertising guidelines, right? They have to follow the law on political ads, make sure the claims are true, stay somewhat neutral.
Sure.
But their reason for rejecting this one, it was super vague.
Like, what did they say?
Something about not discussing internal decisions about ad campaigns.
Okay, so no real transparency.
Exactly. So was this really just an objective decision based on their rules, or did something else play a role? Like maybe the fact that their owner is another tech billionaire who doesn't want to make Elon Musk mad.
It makes you think, right?
It does, and it raises this huge question of media independence.
Can we really trust outlets to publish stuff that challenges powerful people, especially when those people are connected to the media company itself?
And get this, the ad wanted to fire Musk for having too much influence.
Ironic.
But them rejecting the ad kind of proves the point.
It's like they're proving the ad's point exactly. It's a chilling effect, when actions like that make people less likely to speak out.
Oh, I see. So other groups that might want to criticize Musk or other powerful people, they might hesitate.
Yeah, exactly. They worry about losing their platform, getting sued, backlash,
So those dissenting voices get silenced.
And that's especially worrying for groups that are already vulnerable, like those Native Americans we talked about.
They're fighting an uphill battle already.
Exactly. To have their voices silenced on top of that,
it's a bad combination. So these two stories, even though they seem so different, they both show this pattern of power dynamics in our society.
You're right. One's the government maybe using legal tricks for resources and control.
The other is tech giants maybe controlling what we see and hear.
Both stories highlight how much power certain people and groups have and how they use it.
To control the narrative, control resources, control the conversation.
Exactly. That's what we're going to dig into even deeper in part 2.
We are, but before we go, I'm curious, how do you see these two stories connecting? What's the bigger picture here?
That's the heart of it, isn't it? Let's see what these stories tell us about the challenges we face in trying to build a fair and just society, It's about power and vulnerability, right? With the Native Americans, you have a group that's been marginalized forever, and now they're facing this threat to their land, their self-government.
And with the Fire Musk ad.
Even with money and organization, they couldn't get their message out.
So it's like this, no matter where you look, those in power, they can use that power to protect themselves.
And sometimes it's at the expense of those who don't have that power. And what's scary is how sneaky it can be.
What do you mean?
It's not always like in-your-face censorship or oppression.
Right.
It's about controlling the story, what information gets out there, what people are allowed to talk about.
So it's not just who can speak, it's who gets heard.
Exactly. Think about that ad campaign. They had to have tons of money to even try that. Imagine groups with no resources.
It's like the system is rigged.
In a way, yeah. The powerful, they stay powerful, and everyone else struggles to be heard. And that goes back to that chilling effect.
Right, when people are afraid to speak up.
Exactly, because they don't want to lose their platform or get in trouble or whatever. And so nothing changes.
And that's dangerous for everyone.
Absolutely. If we can't hold the powerful accountable, if we can't question them or speak truth to power, then what kind of society are we?
So what can we do? It feels like we're up against these huge forces, the government, big tech. How do we fight back?
It can feel overwhelming for sure. But it's important to remember we're not helpless. Our individual actions, even small ones, they can add up.
So what can our listeners do? What are some real steps they can take?
First, stay informed, stay engaged. Don't just read headlines. Really think about what you're reading and try to get information from different sources.
It's easy to get stuck in an echo chamber, right? Where you only hear what you already agree with.
Exactly. You got to get out of that comfort zone and listen to other viewpoints, even if you don't like them.
And talk to people, right? Even people who disagree with you.
Exactly. Have those tough conversations respectfully. Of course, that's how we start to understand each other.
But what about people who feel like politics is a mess or their vote doesn't matter? What about those who just want to tune it all out?
Tuning out, that's the worst thing you can do. Apathy, that's what the powerful want. They want us to give up and let them run things.
So how do we participate? How do we make our voices heard?
Find what you're passionate about and get involved. You can volunteer for organizations you believe in, contact your elected officials, go to town hall meetings, support independent media outlets. There's so much you can do.
So find your thing and go for it.
Exactly. Even small actions can make a difference. And when we all act together, that's when we can really challenge those in power.
That's inspiring. It's easy to get overwhelmed by all this, but there's always hope and there's always something we can do. You mentioned critical thinking before about questioning what we read and see.
Oh yeah, that's so important. Now more than ever, we're bombarded with information all the time. We have to be smart about it. Who's saying this? Why are they saying it? Where's the evidence?
It's easy to just believe what we see, especially if it comes from a source we trust.
I know, but we have to think for ourselves.
Which brings us to a big question for our listeners. In this age of information overload, how do we make sure we're not just absorbing everything, but actually engaging with it, thinking, critically forming our own opinions?
That's the challenge, isn't it? And it's something we all have to work on. We'll keep talking about it in future deep dive.
We will, but for now, we'll leave everyone with that question to think about. So we've talked about tribal sovereignty and big tech and media, two very different stories, but both show how power works in our world.
Yeah, and how important it is to be aware of these things, to think critically, to participate.
Right, so here's a final thought for everyone. What happens when the places we get our information from become the ones who decide what we see?
You mean like social media search engines, all that?
Exactly. Those algorithms, they're like a black box, you know?
Yes.
Who decides what trends, what we see in our feeds?
It's hard to know if we're getting the full picture or just a version of it that benefits someone else.
Right. So how do we know we're not being manipulated?
It's something we all have to be aware of. These platforms, they connect us, inform us, entertain us, but they also have a huge influence on how we see the world.
And that means they have a responsibility to use that influence for good.
Exactly, to make sure everyone's voice is heard, to encourage critical thinking, to make sure the conversation is healthy and inclusive.
We have a responsibility too. We can't just sit back and accept whatever we see.
We gotta question things, think for ourselves, find different perspectives.
It's easy to just go with the flow, but we have to be active in shaping our own understanding of the world.
And holding those in power accountable. We can't let algorithms and gatekeepers control our reality.
We have to think for ourselves, seek out the truth. This has been a really interesting deep dive.
It has. I'm glad we could have this conversation.
Me too. And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us. Remember, knowledge is power, and finding the truth is something we do together. So stay curious, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions.